that's cheating. No. It's time to take a wild ride back to the past. Sit back and relax and enjoy this episode of Relay.
実は今日発売される新型ゲーム機
Some of you may know who I am.
The $199 Dreamcast comes with a built-in modem.
Some of you might be just a bit too young to know
The
who I am.
Dreamcast, Sega's new game system, is only about 2.5 inches high.
I am just an old guy sitting here today.
But this little gray box holds the faith of a company and the future of an industry.
20 years ago, I entered your living room. I entertained you. I was part of your life. This is a story about me, my life, and my downfall. I am known as the Sega Dreamcast.
This year, Nintendo may be up against some serious competition.
During the late 80s and early 90s, video game corporation Sega gained major popularity with the Sega Genesis, selling over 30 million units worldwide.
What Nintendo don't? The 16-bit Genesis system by Sega. Genesis does it all.
Sega became a main staple in the video game industry, going head-to-head with Nintendo.
I love it. I think it's great.
The 16-bit microprocessor allows for enhanced graphics, more memory capability, stereo sound, depth perception, simulated 3D. You now have a game that is richly enhanced, a game that is very, very similar to that you would find in the arcade.
So what defined the Sega Genesis? The Sega Genesis certainly had great exclusives that defined what made the Sega Genesis so different from the rest. You had games like Streets of Rage, Golden Axe, Sonic the Hedgehog. You had all kinds of exclusives, even a Michael Jackson game. It was a big deal. There's plenty of games on the Genesis that you cannot get on the other consoles. As Sega once said, Genesis does what Nintendo don't.
Sega clearly hopes to leapfrog Nintendo by touting 16-bit's advantages.
You get better graphics, more levels of play, better animation on the screen, longer games, just more fun to play. Our sales right now are up about 50% versus a year ago at the consumer level. The market is down. I think that's an indication of where the consumer is going.
Not only did Sega Genesis have great exclusives, but Sega designed the Sega Genesis console to be future-proof, allowing Sega to develop the Sega CD and 32X console during the later years of the Sega Genesis.
Thank you.
In response to the Sega CD, both Nintendo and Sony worked together, collaborated, to make plans for a CD attachment for the Super Nintendo. As you all may know, those plans fell apart over profit shares. Nintendo began plans to make their next console the Nintendo 64. At the time, a very powerful 64-bit console that will pose a threat to Sega's future plans.
Amazingly fast, 90.35 megahertz. It has the most astounding graphics of any home video game system with a multimedia reality coprocessor. It also has the fastest memory of any home video game system. Not only is it expandable, but it runs at a mind-boggling 500 megahertz. This is like transferring more than 15 copies of Donkey Kong Country every second. The system has no irritating access time because it can instantaneously access any information stored in the cartridge. It's also ready for 1 seconds.
Sony took the original plans for the Super Nintendo CD PlayStation console and developed it into a new console themselves, known as the PlayStation. Now, during the development of both the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation, Sega was hard at work developing the Sega Saturn. The Sega Saturn was indeed a powerhouse with a total of 8 processors, and it was very, very complicated to program on. The Sega Saturn released in November of 1994 in Japan and eventually made it over to the United States in 1995. The Sega Saturn was also released prematurely in the United States for a whopping $399. And what hurt Sega immediately right away was Sony capitalizing on the $399 price point of the Sega Saturn.
Presentation. $299.
The $299 price point of the Sony PlayStation ultimately forced Sega to drop the price point of their Sega Saturn by the holiday seasons of 1995, not even a year after it was released.
Only $299.
The Sega Saturn was doomed from the start, whether it was the console being overly complicated to develop on, or the botched release, the poor price point. The console market was way oversaturated. You had the 3DO, you had the Atari Jaguar, you had the Nintendo 64 coming out soon, you had the PlayStation just coming out. It was a big mess. There was no chance in hell for the Sega Saturn to survive in the United States. Now, unfortunately, the Sega Saturn didn't quite get the same success as what the Sega Genesis did. It wasn't quite as popular, especially in Europe and the United States. The Sega Saturn sold probably around 9.2 million worldwide. It was more popular in Japan. There's a lot more games available for the Sega Saturn over in Japan. Now, even though the Sega Saturn had a handful of great games such as Virtual Cop, Sonic 3D Blast, Knights, Daytona USA, the Sega Saturn was unable to compete against the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation. Despite that fact, the Sega Saturn does remain one of my favorite consoles of all time. There is plenty of hidden gems on the Sega Saturn. Now, unfortunately, the Sega Saturn took third place behind the Nintendo 64 and PlayStation. But Sega had something else up their sleeves: the Sega Dreamcast. Dating all the way back to the SG-1000 and the Sega Master System, the soon-to-be-released Sega Dreamcast evolved from classic gaming consoles such as the Sega Genesis, the Mega Drive, classic Sega Saturn, so we must understand how magical the Sega Dreamcast was, a rich history of gaming consoles. Both the Sega Genesis, Mega Drive, Sega Saturn all had probably a great reputation for their controllers. They're definitely excellent for fighting games. Definitely the best controller of all time for fighting games, in my opinion, was the Sega Saturn. I love playing any Street Fighter game on the Sega Saturn. The controller is awesome for that game. So once I caught news that the Sega Dreamcast was coming out, man, I couldn't wait to see what the Sega Dreamcast looked like and how it played out with Street Fighter games and any other fighting game for that matter. I love fighting games. Once I laid eyes on the Sega Dreamcast for the first time, it was probably one of the most attractive looking gaming consoles I've ever seen. The aerodynamics of the controller and the console, it looked fantastic. In fact, the first game I've ever played on the Sega Dreamcast was one of the Marvel vs. Capcom games. It blew my mind, and I've always wanted to have a Dreamcast since then. And now, I own 2 Dreamcast consoles. Dreamcast may have just been the perfect storm. On November 27th, 1998, the Sega Dreamcast launched in the great country of Japan. The 128-bit console made its debut in Japan, and right away you had 4 launch games available in Japan. And, the Dreamcast sold out in 24 hours. It was record-breaking sales. So the 4 games that were available during that time were Godzilla Generations, July, Pen Triathlon, Virtual Fighter 3 TB. Now the Virtual Fighter game is pretty much the reason why this console sold out so quick over in Japan. It's a very, very popular game over in Japan back in the day. Definitely huge on the Sega Saturn, huge in the arcade. Definitely, this game by itself is what made the launch special over in Japan. It's definitely Very, very monumental game over in Japan, and eventually the Virtual Fighter games carried out over on the PS2 and other gaming consoles. But yeah, this Dreamcast launched in Japan. It sold out in 24 hours. It was gone by the end of the day. That was it. Record-breaking sales. Special, awesome launch over in Japan.
This is the day you have trained for. The day you have studied for. Utilize your superior skills. Your superior intelligence.
Sit down, rodent!
Oh dear.
Sarah, baby! Oh, you were one.
Don't make me hurt you. Learn to defeat your ruthless enemy, Steve of Hackensack.
Brian, you're gonna get roofed.
Shut up, quadruped.
Sega Dreamcast. It's thinking.
Now, over in the US, you had a campaign going on, the 9999. Huge hype. There's a lot of hype going on with this September 9th, 1999 campaign for the Sega Dreamcast. I remember back in the day, I was in middle school, and they had the commercials with all the Sega characters, all the gaming characters, and it was mind-blowing. It's like, it cannot be possibly that good. Well, it was that good, because on 9/9/99, Sega Dreamcast launched in the United States, and it was the perfect storm. They had a total of 19 games at launch, and these were not just, regular crappy games. These were all really good games, in my opinion. I mean, you had games like Expendable, The House of the Dead 2, Hydro Thunder. You had Mortal Kombat Gold right on the launch. I mean, holy crap. You had NFL Blitz 2000. What a great game. Ready to Rumble Boxing. Do you remember that game on the Dreamcast? That game blew my mind when I first saw it. You had Soul Calibur, probably my favorite Soul Calibur game of all time, the Dreamcast version. Sonic Adventures, the first Sonic Adventures, oh my god. I mean, you had Trick Style, the really, really cool sci-fi, like skateboarding, snowboarding type thing going on there. Tokyo Extreme Racer, you had TNN and Motorsports, Hardcore Heat. You had a lot of different games here. Power Stone. I mean, holy crap, this was an awesome launch. There's plenty of games. I mean, take my money now. I would definitely go back, time travel back to 1999, and I would rebuy the Sega Dreamcast at launch with all these games, all 19 games. I'm buying them all.
The graphics. Better graphics means it's more realistic.
The $199 Dreamcast comes with a built-in modem, making it the first set built for online gaming. 18 games will be available right away. You can fight, fish, or skateboard. There's also a much-anticipated football game, NFL Y2K.
Which, to quote all the media today, is saying this is by far the best sports simulator ever brought to gaming.
And of course, we can't leave Europe out. Over in Europe, the Sega Dreamcast launched in October 14th, 1999, and the perfect storm carried on, traveled over to Europe. You had 10 games at launch. I mean, this is another spectacular launch by Sega Dreamcast. You had games like Dynamite Cop, which we did not even have that at launch. I'm jealous of Europe. Oh my god, I would travel all the way to Europe to get that game. You had Expendables. You also had Sega Rally Championship 2. That's definitely a popular game over in Europe. I remember the Dreamcast, actually the Sega Saturn game was quite popular over in Europe. Sega Rally. You guys got a Sega Bass Fishing. Like, wow. I'm pretty sure that came out eventually around the same time over in the United States in October. But man, you guys had a pretty stacked launch also. You had Toy Commander, that was an awesome game. You also had Sonic Adventures as well, and you guys got Virtual Fighter also at launch. For some reason in the United States, we didn't get that at launch quite right away. I'm not sure what the deal is with that. But yeah, the launch of the Sega Dreamcast was spectacular. It was definitely record-breaking sales here and there. It was insane. It was definitely much superior to the first PlayStation, the Nintendo 64. It shattered records. So let's take a look at the specs inside this machine. What exactly possessed people to go out to buy the Sega Dreamcast? What blew people's minds? What are the specs inside this magical box known as the Sega Dreamcast? Well, let's take a look inside the Sega Dreamcast and let's take a look at the specs right here. The CPU is a 128-bit Hitachi 200 megahertz. It has 16 megabytes of RAM. It's capable of doing 300 million per second polygon count. And its standard resolution is 640 by 480. And it uses a media storage GD-ROM up to 1.2 gigabytes of storage. That's quite a bit for back then. The audio processor inside the Sega Dreamcast was designed by Yamaha and was capable of doing 64 voice channels at once. It's quite impressive. And much like the Sega Genesis and the Sega Saturn, the Sega Dreamcast also had an arcade counterpart, the Sega Naomi, and its specs are quite similar. It has pretty much the same exact CPU. The RAM is twice as much. The polygon count is slightly higher because the GPU in the Naomi is a slightly improved version of what the Dreamcast has. The resolution actually ranges from a lower resolution to a much higher resolution than what the Dreamcast can handle. And the media storage is pretty much the same as what the Dreamcast has. And the sound is capable of producing twice the amount of audio channels, or voice channels that is. So yeah, the Sega was pretty much giving you a reason to go to the arcade, but at the same time they gave you like an arcade quality experience right in your home, just like they did with the Sega Genesis and the Sega Saturn. Now I know what you're wondering, how does this stack up to the other consoles that came out afterwards and maybe a console that came out prior to that? Well, in comparison to the Nintendo 64, the Sega Dreamcast had a CPU that was twice as powerful. And also, the Sega Dreamcast had nearly 4 times the amount of RAM as Nintendo 64. The polygon count, there's a pretty big difference. You had 3 million on the Dreamcast, only 100,000 per second on the Nintendo 64. As much as the 64 is a great console, it came out years prior to the Dreamcast. The resolution is about the same, which is nice. The cartridges on the Nintendo 64 only held up to 64 megabytes at most. While of course over on the Dreamcast you can handle up to 1.2 gigs on a GD-ROM disc. Now respectfully, the Nintendo 64 had a 16-bit audio chip that can handle up to 24 channels, voice channels, and it's not quite comparable to the Dreamcast in terms of audio quality, but for what it's worth, the Nintendo 64 was quite the powerful machine in itself when it first came out. Now, if you're comparing it to, let's say, the PlayStation 2, the PlayStation 2 does have a faster CPU. The RAM is twice as much on the PlayStation 2, unfortunately. However, the video RAM, which is not listed, is much more on the Dreamcast. It's like twice as much. So the Dreamcast technically can produce better textures on certain games. The polygon count, for whatever reason, is much higher in the PlayStation 2. I don't know why exactly it's that much higher, but according to specs that I read online, that's exactly around the amount that PlayStation 2 can actually produce at most. The resolution is about the same. However, the PlayStation 2 does have an edge on resolution because technically it can put out HD graphics on certain games. They can actually go up to 1080. And of course, the media was the big thing that was the big competition with the Dreamcast. The PlayStation 2 had DVD capability. You could play DVDs, and most of the games actually came on DVD discs. And the DVD discs, if they're dual layered, they were all the way up to 8.5 gigs of storage, which nearly 8 times the capacity of a Dreamcast disc. That's pretty nuts. And of course, the audio voice channels on the PlayStation 2, you're capable of going up to 48 channels. And of course, the PlayStation 2 had optical ports, so they're capable of doing Dolby Digital 5.1. Now, the next console that we'll do a comparison to right here is the GameCube. GameCube is what I would consider the direct competition to the Sega Dreamcast. The GameCube had a 485 MHz IBM powered PC processor. It's twice as fast as the Dreamcast processor. Now, the IBM processor and the Hitachi processor, they probably don't measure identically by numbers, so I don't know if they're theoretically close in specs. Now, according to specs that are listed online, the GameCube actually has 48 megabytes of total RAM. Now, the RAM is non-unified RAM, so the RAM is divided into a couple of different types of RAM, but it totals up to 48 megabytes. Now, the GameCube is also capable of producing 75 million polygons per second, the same as the PlayStation 2. These are max counts, so there's probably not really any game that exists that took advantage of that. And, the resolution is pretty much the same as the Dreamcast. And of course, as you already know, the GameCube uses the little mini DVD discs. Pretty much close to the same exact storage as what the Dreamcast uses on the normal size disc. Apparently you can fit a little bit more on the GameCube disc, which is quite surprising. And of course you can get 64 channels, voice channels on the GameCube, which is pretty much the same as what you can get on the Dreamcast. So my guess is the GameCube and the Dreamcast were pretty close, pretty identical, for the exception the polygon counts were much higher, which my guess is the RAM definitely helped out with that, because there's quite a bit more RAM in the GameCube. And then last but not least, we have the old school OG original Xbox right here with the big Duke controller right there. Look at that thing. And of course, this thing was built like a PC, so it's not a fair comparison at all. I mean, look at this. This thing had a Pentium 3 processor in it. 733 megahertz. My God. That's insane for a gaming console back then. What the hell? And it had 64 megabytes of RAM, which is like 4 times the amount of RAM as the Dreamcast. It's nuts. And the polygon count was through the roof. I mean, look at that. It was capable of doing over 100 million per second. I don't think there was a game that actually took advantage of that, but the Xbox was a powerful beast. The resolution was about the same as what you can get on the Dreamcast. There was a standard resolution for during that era, 640 by 480. And of course, the media used DVD discs. And as you already know, DVDs were a big deal back then. Oh, DVD movies, oh, they're nice and fancy. And of course, the PlayStation 2 and the Xbox can actually play movies, and most of the games came out on DVD discs. And the audio channels, like the voice channels, you can get the 64 different voice channels, which is about the same as what you would be able to do on the Sega Dreamcast. It's definitely a little bit higher performance than the PS2. But yeah, the Xbox was the most powerful gaming console that came out during that time period. But I would say the Sega Dreamcast, despite having the least amount of specs, it really shined. It really performed quite as well as any other gaming console that came out around that time. It was great. So you look at Dead or Alive on Dreamcast, you would definitely confuse it with an Xbox game. Despite the hardware limitations, the Dreamcast had plenty of hidden gems, and it was fully capable of lasting all the way up to like 2005, 2006, just like any other normal gaming console. Just to name a few hidden gems on the Sega Dreamcast, right here we have Bomber Ha-He, a Japanese import. It was planned to be released in North America, but it was banned due to the 9/11 attacks. Basically, in Bomber Ha-He, your objective is to destroy buildings. It's a building demolition simulator. Out of all the Dreamcast games I've ever played, this is the one that I spent the most hours on. This game is actually quite fun. Now, unfortunately, this game was planned to be released a little bit after the 9/11 attacks and quickly got banned. The next hidden gem would be Cannon Spike. It's a nice, fast-paced, top-down shooter. Cannon Spike is quite the common game. It does go for a lot of money on eBay. But this game definitely will provide you with tons of fun that some of the other consoles didn't quite give you at that time. Definitely nice graphics, great game, nice hidden gem on the Sega Dreamcast. Love playing this game in. I definitely love playing this game time to time again. And then of course you have Godzilla Generations Maximum Impact. Now for all you Godzilla fans out there, this is definitely a great hidden gem. It's a unique Godzilla game with plenty of monster battles. There's definitely parts of the games where you stomp through the city, as you can see here. Definitely one of my favorite Godzilla games of all time. The first Godzilla game on the Dreamcast was a bit of a thud. I actually remember seeing the gameplay of the first Godzilla game on GameSpot way back on ZDTV a long time ago, back in like '98. Watching it on TV, they were actually demonstrating the game, and it actually blew my mind, even if the game wasn't that good. I love Godzilla. I love Godzilla video games. This game right here, if you love Godzilla, you definitely want to play this game. I guess you can almost think of it as Panzer Dragoon, but with Godzilla. And that's a pretty badass combination. And then of course we have Zombie Revenge for the Sega Dreamcast. Unfortunately there was no Streets of Rage on the Sega Dreamcast, but hey, we got Zombie Revenge. Pretty damn awesome, unique beat 'em up game. And of course it features zombies and different crazy looking creatures. And you can use your boomstick and blow their brains out. Or you can beat the crap out of them. Definitely an awesome game on the Sega Dreamcast. Now there's plenty of hidden gems on the Dreamcast, but I'll end it at this one right here, Illbleed. A very twisted horror game on the Sega Dreamcast. It only released on the Dreamcast. It's quite the unique horror game. Definitely this game has scared the crap out of me time to time again. This game is definitely very unique. You play different episodes. It's a really weird horror game. I cannot speak of it. You have to definitely try it for yourself. Very, very unique graphics. It doesn't look scary at first, but once you play it, it has a lot of jump scares. It's definitely a very, very interesting horror game to say the least. Very, very good hidden gem on the Sega Dreamcast. Fortunately, as you may know, the Sega Dreamcast ended its production around 2001. The console definitely could have went on to like 2005, 2006. Can you imagine all the games that would have came out on Dreamcast if it would have lasted longer? But unfortunately, the Dreamcast had a lot of stiff competition.
Now, the operating system is Windows CE. What's that going to do for the Dreamcast?
Well, apparently it's a pretty easy operating system to program for, especially for PC game developers who want to port their games over to the Dreamcast. But in addition, I mean, I guess it's just a robust operating system to begin with. In fact, Microsoft has more employees working on Windows CE than they do on Windows 98.
There are waiting lists and tickets just to stand in line and get a chance to buy PlayStation 2. That is PlayStation 2, the hottest game to hit the market, and it arrives in the U.S. tomorrow. But some people are standing in line already trying to buy this toy.
As you already know, the Sega Dreamcast had serious competition right around the corner. The Sony PlayStation 2 launched in March of 2000 over in Japan with a handful of games, and eventually it released over in the United States in October 2000. Over 20 games at launch. It seemed like Sony had purposely beat up this Dreamcast. I'm not sure what the deal is with that. They had to do what they had to do. It was business. By November of 2000, the PlayStation 2 released over in Europe, and once again they had a pretty decent handful of games that released over in Europe, and it was pretty rough for the Sega Dreamcast during that time. Everybody was trying to shift momentum to the PlayStation 2. Some people may think that the PlayStation 2 might have heavily contributed to the reason why the Dreamcast failed. At the time, DVD players were quite expensive, so why not kill two birds with one stone and buy a PlayStation 2? It plays your PS1 games, and it plays the new PS2 games, and it plays DVD movies. Of course, that's the process that people thought back then. And then, eventually the GameCube came out in September 2001 in Japan, and then over in November of 2001 United States. And by the time the GameCube and the Xbox came out, the Dreamcast was pretty much finished at that point. There was no competition. The console market was oversaturated. I mean, there was absolutely no room for the Dreamcast at all. Dreamcast quickly disappeared off shelves in stores, and eventually that was it. The only thing that was pretty much left on Dreamcast was whatever you can find at like a pawn shop, or maybe somewhere buy used games, things like that. But there's a lot of conspiracy theories on why Dreamcast failed. Let's take a look at what possibly caused the Dreamcast to fail.
いつもより3時間も早い開店となりました。
The Sega Dreamcast successfully launched in Japan, North America, and all over the world. But was the Sega Dreamcast doomed, just like the Sega Saturn? Let's find out. All the way back in 1997, the Los Angeles Times pretty much had an article stating that it may be Sega's last year in the console market. They may have to hang up their boots, as they had the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation really crawling down their necks, and the competition was just too much for Sega. And they pretty much have a whole article on that. It was dating back to around when E3 occurred in 1997. Sega pretty much had nothing to deliver to the table in competition to PlayStation and Nintendo 64, despite the fact that I love the Sega Saturn, but They really couldn't compete against the PlayStation and the 64, unfortunately. There was no chance of that happening in the United States. Back in March of 1998, the New York Times reported that Sega pulled the Sega Saturn off the video game market in the US. That was it. Sega was unable to compete against Nintendo and Sony with the PlayStation and the Nintendo 64. The Sega Saturn definitely had a lot of bad luck during its run in the United States, and that was it. There was no more left to be done in the United States with the Sega Saturn. The PlayStation took off like a storm. Nintendo 64 was doing just fine, and unfortunately the Saturn was last place. Back in May of 1998, Microsoft announced that they basically partnered with Sega on the Dreamcast project. The Windows CE technology was definitely going to be integrated into the Sega Dreamcast, and DirectX technology was going to be used on the Sega Dreamcast as well. Also, Microsoft also promised Web TV and a lot of various other things for the Sega Dreamcast, especially over in Japan. As you may know, that never actually happened, but the Windows CE technology stamp remained on the front of the Dreamcast. So if you own a Dreamcast, you look at the front right of the Dreamcast, you see Microsoft Windows CE technology. In November of 1998, ZDNet, classic ZDNet, announced that Sega is out for revenge. And if you're not familiar with Bernard Stellar, he was once the executive vice president of Sony Computer Entertainment of America, PlayStation. He was actually the first vice president of basically the PlayStation brand in North America. And he was also president of Atari that led the Atari Lynx division back in the early 90s, which was a great handheld, by the way, very underrated. And Sega hired him, and he became the chief operator officer of Sega of America, and he engaged in developing and launching the Sega Dreamcast. And definitely he was out for revenge against Sony. He was hell-bent on kicking their ass. In a translated Japanese article, PC Watch pretty much wrote back in November of 1998, bragging about the Windows CE technology in the Sega Dreamcast, and the price point was at 2,900 yen, 29,000 yen that is. And Mr. Aruma, the president of Sega of Japan, went on to eventually state that the Web TV and Internet Explorer will be available in the future for the Sega Dreamcast through Microsoft. You know, at this time, Microsoft was definitely heavily involved in creating the online service for Sega, and eventually that fell apart after Microsoft decided to use the Dreamcast as a stepping stone and start making their own console. And Sega was forced to develop their own online service. And the Web TV and the Internet Explorer never happened. Around June 4th, 2000, Microsoft and Sega ended their gaming relationship with each other. Basically what happened here, Microsoft went behind Sega's back and they started developing the Xbox project. And Microsoft basically used Sega as a stepping stone. They basically got a little taste of the gaming market, and they used Sega as a stepping stone. They definitely had a lot of disregards for the Dreamcast because a lot of the developers really did not take advantage of the DirectX technology and the Windows CE technology. It was interesting because Microsoft had definitely made a lot of promises for creating the online service for the Dreamcast, Web TV, Internet Explorer for the Dreamcast, which thankfully that didn't happen. It's probably not a good idea to use Internet Explorer on anything, but Microsoft definitely turned their back on Sega. And of course, the legendary Sega chairman Isao quoted the following: "Our business with Microsoft is finished." For those of you who own a Sega Dreamcast, you might be familiar with Akulon. As a very, very mysterious individual who leaked out a lot of video games between September of 2000 and all the way into 2002. There's plenty of conspiracy rumors about this Echelon guy, including possibly Microsoft paying him to leak out Sega Dreamcast games on purpose to ruin the actual Sega Dreamcast. Apparently he leaked over 180 games, and there's rumors that this individual might have actually worked for Sega himself, and it's unknown who this person is, but they got their hands on games before they even released at times and released it to the public. And by 2002 to 2005, around those years, it was very, very popular to download Dreamcast games and bring them onto CDRs. I personally remember back while in high school, back around 2003, 2004, burning a few Dreamcast games here and there onto discs and playing them on the Sega Dreamcast. Around that time, it was nearly impossible to find Dreamcast games in the stores because they pulled them off the shelf. Now, unfortunately, the fact that Dreamcast can actually play burned games on CDR discs with no modification definitely contributed to the reason why the Dreamcast failed. On September 15th, 2008, Kotaku, the famous video game website, solved the mystery on what killed the Dreamcast and the hardware division in Sega. It was no other than Peter Moore himself. He definitely admitted to putting the nail in the coffin. Not exactly sure how this happened, but Peter Moore was actually able to fire a whole bunch of Japanese Sega of Japan workers that were responsible for the hardware division of Sega. And somehow he gained the ability to do so. During his time with Sega, he grew some sort of relationship with Microsoft and eventually jumped over to Microsoft. So maybe you can add this onto the conspiracy list. Maybe he purposely pulled Sega out of the hardware market, jumped to Microsoft just to make his job easier. And before he went to Microsoft, somehow Sega started making games for Xbox right before he jumped to Microsoft. So maybe he initiated that relationship to force Sega games to be on the Xbox system. I don't know, that's a wild conspiracy theory, but it's very, very interesting. One thing that I can tell you though is that Sega of Japan, the hardware division, at that time, they were actually working on making another console. At first, they were working on making a Dreamcast that had DVD capabilities, and they were working on an additional feature Sega console. And Peter Moore put an end to that. The hardware division was actually ready to continue making consoles for Sega. Now, the absolute worst news imaginable for Sega occurred in March of 2001. Iso Aqua, pretty much the head of Sega, he passed away at age 74. Those of you who may not be familiar with Iso Aqua, this guy literally funded Sega with his own money. Now, back in January of 2001, Iso Aqua claimed that he wanted to contribute $730 million to Sega to help them with their debt. And a lot of the debt that Sega was in actually came from Iso Aqua's pocket. He actually funded Sega. And, right before he passed away, he actually forgave Sega of all of their debt, which was $500 million. So, $500 million on top of the $730 million, which is another $500 million. This guy loved Sega. He loved the Dreamcast. He loved the Sega Saturn. And he definitely wanted Sega to continue making hardware. On January 20th, 2003, Microsoft announces appointment of Peter Moore as Corporate Vice President of Retail Sales and Marketing. And that's quite interesting. Peter Moore previously worked for Sega, as you may already know, and he fired all the hardware division in Sega over in Japan. He was the man that was responsible for that. It's quite interesting that Microsoft used Sega as a stepping stone to get to the Xbox, and then Peter Moore jumped from Sega to Microsoft after the whole ordeal happened. It makes you wonder, was this an inside job? Kind of like a crazy conspiracy theory going on here, but yeah, just think about it for a second. So you may ask yourself, what really killed the Sega Dreamcast? Well, I don't think it was the PlayStation 2 with the DVD playback, or the soon-to-be-released Nintendo GameCube, but I would have to point the finger over towards Microsoft. It appears that the Dreamcast was pushed straight off a cliff as soon as Microsoft announced the Xbox project. And once again, the console market became very, very saturated with a lot of consoles, so there wasn't room for all these consoles. One of them had to go. Unfortunately, it was the Dreamcast.
One of the sector's big players is Sega Dreamcast. Mike shows us how it is hoping to blunt the heavily promoted launch this fall of Sony's PlayStation 2.
As important as new games are, the coming release of PlayStation 2, the talked about future release of Nintendo's Dolphin system, and if Microsoft follows through with its Xbox, games themselves won't be enough to drive the market. The PlayStation platform can also play DVDs, and at Sega, it's banking its future online.
実は今日発売される新型ゲーム機ドリームキャストを買うために徹夜で過ごした人たちの行列です。一歩前に出てください。恐れ入ります。急にお店の前が騒がしくなりました。午前7時35分です。どうやらドリームキャストの発売が開始されたようです。いつもより3時間も早い開店となりました。新型ゲーム機の顔、この人も登場しました。今日は湯川専務自ら。
もう一応ね、ここまでしましたんで、もうたくさん来ていただいてますね。
Until now, online gaming has been the domain of PC users. Well, that's about to change with Sega's online Dreamcast network. Based on what you've seen of the system, would you buy a Dreamcast? Have you ordered one already? Visit the GameSpot TV website and take our Dreamcast poll. And if you'd like to learn more about the Dreamcast, go to the Dreamcast dossier feature on videogames.com.
The PlayStation platform can also play DVDs, and at Sega, it's banking its future online.
We believe in pure gameplay, and as a result, our biggest focus will be taking gamers online.
Starting in late August and using Dreamcast's built-in 56K modem, gamers will be able to play console games against one another thousands or hundreds of miles apart. Sega having made the decision not to wait for a broadband solution, but rather using today's narrowband technology.
We look at data that says that 80% of consumers, even in 2003, will connect via a narrowband connection, a dial-up modem. So our plan is to take advantage of that rather than wait for broadband.
The first game that Sega plans to introduce online is NFL 2K1, and Sony plans to unleash PlayStation 2 in the U.S. sometime late September, early October.
This is only the beginning.